Welcome to the Respirable Crystalline Silica webinar. This presentation is designed to provide employers in the construction industry with a comprehensive understanding of the new Respirable Crystalline Silica standard in California. Upon completion of this training, you'll have a good understanding of the following learning objectives: what respirable crystalline silica is and the health hazards associated with it, the requirements under the new Cal OSHA standard, and how to comply with the new standard. Silica is one of the most common minerals on the planet. It's in the sand on our beaches and the quartz of our mountains and land masses. There are three forms of silica: quartz, cristobalite, and tridymite. Quartz is the most common form of crystalline silica found on construction sites. Silica is not dangerous to humans in and of itself. The hazards associated with it start when we work to manipulate it, and that's exactly what happens in construction. When materials that contain silica are disturbed, they generate small particles that can be over 100 times smaller than sand. These particles can get into your lungs, and once they go in, they don't come out. Some common tasks that disturb silica and make it dangerous for workers are chipping, cutting, sawing, drilling, grinding, sanding, crushing rock, stone, or concrete. Additionally, if your work puts you in a dusty area, you need to be aware of your surroundings as silica may be present. It's important to understand the new silica standard is designed to protect workers against health hazards associated with the inhalation of respirable crystalline silica. These health hazards include silicosis, lung cancer, kidney disease, and autoimmune disorders. Extensive evidence has shown that lung cancer and silicosis occur at exposure levels below 100 micrograms per cubic meter. The new respirable crystalline silica standard has been adopted by Cal OSHA under the California Code of Regulations, Title 8, Section 1532.3. The effective date for Cal OSHA to start enforcing the new standard in the construction industry occurred on September 23, 2017. The new permissible exposure limit, or PEL, for respirable crystalline silica is 50 micrograms per cubic meter. The action level is half of that at 25 micrograms per cubic meter. The permissible exposure limit and action level are both expressed in an 8-hour time-weighted average. This means that over the course of an 8-hour work shift, exposures can fluctuate, but the average exposure cannot exceed the required limit. The new silica standard requires employers to implement a written exposure control plan. The written exposure control plan must include the following: it must describe the tasks that involve exposure to respirable crystalline silica. It must identify control measures, including engineering controls, work practices, and respiratory protection that will be used to limit employee exposure. It must outline housekeeping measures used to limit exposure. It also must describe the procedures that will be used to restrict access to the work area, limiting the number of employees exposed. Employers are required to review and evaluate the effectiveness of this plan each year, updated as necessary, and make it available to employees. The Center of Construction Research and Training has an online tool to help employers develop their written exposure control plan. This tool can be found at www.silica-safe.org. The new standard includes restrictions on housekeeping measures. Housekeeping may not include the use of dry broom sweeping or compressed air unless used with ventilation. The standard does allow the use of special vacuum sweepers containing HEPA filters, and it does allow sweeping with a broom if floor compounds that keep the dust from becoming airborne are used. The new standard for construction provides a specified exposure control method for employers to achieve compliance. The employer can fully and properly implement what is referred to as Table 1. Table 1 includes 18 common tasks performed on construction sites. For each task, the table provides the required control measures, such as engineering controls, work practices, housekeeping measures, and the use of respiratory protection. It's important to understand that employers who comply with Table 1 are not required to conduct exposure assessments or comply with the permissible exposure limit, since following the table assures the levels of silica are safe for that task. Please note, if an employer follows Table 1, they are still required to develop the written exposure control plan. Here's a sample of a Table 1 task for stationary masonry saws. The engineering control requires an integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the saw's blade. Generally, this is achieved with a nozzle attached near the blade that is connected to a water basin by a hose and pump. The work practice control requires the saw to be operated and maintained in accordance with manufacturer's instructions. You can see the right side of the table indicates for this task no respiratory protection is required, regardless of the task's duration. If an employer fully implements the engineering controls and work practices for this task, they will be in compliance with the new silica standard. Employers that are unable to comply with Table 1 must follow alternative exposure control methods. These methods require employers to assess the 8-hour time-weighted average exposure for each employee who is expected to be exposed to respirable crystalline silica at or above the action level of 25 micrograms per cubic meter. The purpose of performing the assessment is to identify where exposures are occurring, helping employers select control methods and preventing employees from being exposed. Employers can choose from two options for assessing exposures. The performance option allows employers to determine the 8-hour time-weighted average exposure for each employee based on any combination of air monitoring data or objective data. The air monitoring data can be obtained by collecting air samples in the field followed by laboratory analysis. Objective data is information that demonstrates silica exposure with a particular product or material, a specific process, task, or activity. The data must reflect workplace conditions that closely resemble higher exposures than the employer's current operations. The scheduled monitoring option lets employers know when and how often they must perform exposure monitoring. If the initial assessment shows results below the action level of 25 micrograms per cubic meter, no additional monitoring is needed unless there is a change in the process. If exposures are above the action level but below the permissible exposure limit, the employer needs to repeat the monitoring every 6 months. If exposures are above the permissible exposure limit, then the assessment needs to be repeated every 3 months. When two non-initial monitoring results taken consecutively at least 7 days apart, but within 6 months of each other are below the action level, employers can stop monitoring. Employers must reassess exposures whenever changes occur that may reasonably be expected to result in new exposure levels. Employers must notify each affected employee in writing of the assessment results within 5 working days of completing it, and employers are also required to maintain records for air monitoring and objective data. Once the exposure assessment has been completed, employers must follow the hierarchy of controls to reduce employee exposures below the permissible exposure limit. The hierarchy of controls consists of engineering controls, work practices, and respiratory protection. The primary types of engineering controls are wet methods, local exhaust ventilation, and isolation. Work practice controls involve performing a task in a way that reduces the likelihood of exposure. An example would be wetting down silica dust before sweeping it up. Respiratory protection should be used if engineering controls and work practices cannot reduce exposure levels below the permissible exposure limit. It's important to understand that even when engineering and work practice controls cannot reduce exposure levels below the permissible exposure limit, those controls must still be used to reduce the exposure as low as possible. By doing so, the employer can increase the choice of respirators that can be used. Employers who follow the specified exposure control methods listed in Table 1 must provide respiratory protection where required by Table 1. Employers who follow alternative exposure control methods must provide respiratory protection where exposures exceed the permissible exposure limit of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. Employers must also implement a written respiratory protection program and must also meet requirements under Cal OSHA's Respiratory Protection Standard. OSHA's Respiratory Protection Standard will not be covered in this webinar. If you need assistance complying with the Respiratory Protection Standard, please contact the InterWest Risk Control Department for assistance. Under certain circumstances, the new silica standard requires a medical surveillance program to be set up. In the event an employee must use a respirator for more than 30 days per year, the medical surveillance program must be put in place. Under this requirement, at no expense or lost time work to the employee, a medical examination must be performed on the employee by a physician or licensed healthcare professional. The employer will be provided with a written medical opinion from the physician, and the employer must use this information to implement any work requirements recommended by the physician. Employers must maintain these records and make sure each employee receives a copy of the written medical opinion within 30 days of each examination. The employer is required to appoint a competent person to ensure there is proper use of the exposure control plan. The competent person will perform regular inspections on job sites, materials, and equipment to ensure silica controls are in place and effective. A competent person is defined as an individual capable of identifying existing and foreseeable respirable crystalline silica hazards who has authorization to take prompt corrective measures. The new standard does not require specific training for a competent person. The employer is responsible for determining what training is necessary to provide the knowledge and ability for his or her competent person to implement the written exposure control plan. Employers must train and inform employees about respirable crystalline silica hazards and the methods the employer intends on using to limit employee exposures. Employees must train at the time they are assigned to a position involving exposure to silica. Employers must also comply with OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard, which requires informing employees of hazardous chemicals such as respirable crystalline silica through their written hazard communication program. The Hazard Communication Standard will not be covered in this webinar. If you need assistance complying with the Hazardous Communication Standard, please contact the InterWest Risk Control Department for assistance. Some additional resources that will help employers with their compliance efforts can be found on Cal OSHA's website. FedOSHA has a small entity compliance guide for construction that provides a detailed breakdown of the new standard and guidance for compliance. Also, tool manufacturers like Bosch, Hilti, and DeWalt have designed power tools and accessories in accordance with the new silica standard. That concludes our webinar. If you have any questions or require additional assistance, please direct them to Monica Childs with the InterWest Risk Control Department. Thank you for your time and participation.